Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here. I got another Master Duel video for you. So today we're going to be taking a look at another meta tier list, which we haven't done in a little while now. And I figure that now is definitely going to be as good a time as any to go over this, because I've been seeing a lot of comments over the last week or so asking, what is the best Sprite variant? Is this deck, good during Sprite, this deck being, just about any given deck, really. So we'll talk a little bit about how the meta has been progressing since the release of Sprites, where I think everything is at, and what the meta is going to look like moving forward as well. So before I start this video, though, I did want to make a quick announcement. As many of you probably know, I do have a Patreon, and I actually recently just added a new tier onto the Patreon there. It is a coaching tier, so I'm offering some coaching sessions over there on Patreon. If you're interested in one-on-one 60-minute sessions where we can talk via Discord, if you have any specific questions, if you need help with deck building, gameplay, feel free to sign up for that tier over there. The link to the Patreon is going to be in the description below. And then on top of that coaching session each month that you pledge there, that tier also comes with all the other benefits that are included on the Patreon as well. All the daily exclusive Master Duel content that gets posted over there. So again, if you're interested, feel free to check that out, linked in the description below. In any case, let's go ahead and talk about some of these decks here. I'm just going to dive straight into it. First off, we have Adamancipator. So this is a deck that's very much been bouncing kind of all over the tier list in the last few months. We've seen it in Rogue for a lot of the time. After Sword Soul came out is when I think Adamancipator started really to decline in popularity. But then it kind of crept back up into tier 3 and then really even tier 2. Leading up to the release of, I think it was honestly, even when Circular and the new Sky Striker support came out, I think that was about the time that one of the hits got. It's funny because Adamancipator has had 3 successive hits. It was I think it was Block Dragon to 1, then Grass to 2, then Unique Carrier banned. So, even after Adamancipator had 2 of their Block Dragons banned, they were still definitely a solid tier 3 deck. And even when Grass was at 2, would still argue they're a solid tier 3 deck. Now, though, they're definitely decidedly rogue. Definitely still not a bad deck. I think not only, the release of Sprites making a lot of other decks seem a lot less powerful, but, of course, again, all those hits that I mentioned are probably turning a lot of people off of Adamancipator, but the deck is definitely not bad by any means. This is definitely a deck you could still very easily get Diamond with, and probably even Diamond 1 if you're a dedicated enough pilot there. So, Adamancipator, yeah, rogue, but I would definitely say it's upper rogue. Alright, next up we have Branded Despia. This has been, pretty much since its release up until now, a pretty solid tier 1 threat. There was an argument that it was at tier 2, post Mathmech Circular and Sky Striker support. That was about the time it started to see, a bit of a decline in popularity, but I would still argue that it was still tier 1 power level at that time. I think we saw that best represented in the first weekend of the MCS, where 2 of 10 total Branded Despia decks made top 16 and then met each other in the finals. So that was definitely a good showing of the power the deck had then, and the deck is definitely still very solid now. Now I would definitely say it's a solid tier 2 deck, though. Before, like I said, Sprites came out, I would have argued that it was still a tier 1 deck, even if some people put it in tier 2. But now, I definitely think it is still a very good deck, but definitely decidedly in tier 2 there. Alright, next up we have Marincess. So, Marincess, this has been a deck that's honestly been a staying force and is still a very, very good deck. The loss of Totally Awesome recently is a bit of a blow to the deck, but not a deadly one or anything. This deck is definitely still far more than competent. I would definitely put it in the rogue category, though. It was probably already there, honestly, even before Sprites came out, but it's funny, you can almost kind of think of Sprites as pushing, in a way, not directly, but pushing everything else down a tier level. That's kind of what happened, but there's more to it than that. And we'll talk about that as we keep going into some of these decks here. Alright, next up we have Ignister. So Ignister definitely received a very nice power boost upon the release of Mathmech Circular. That engine became a very good staying force to the deck. It allows you to more consistently get the 6k Arrival Cybers. If you choose to, main deck the Super Factorial and the Placian, you can have that set up along with 5k Arrival with still, a 1-card combo, but... Ignister was definitely still a good deck before then, but only got more powerful. So I would argue that Ignister is actually still in Tier 3. I think it was probably... You could make an argument for lower Tier 2, upper Tier 3 before the release of Sprites, but I think even post-Sprite, it's still a very solid Tier 3 deck. I will definitely say that I, even when, building Sprite decks now, I'm still consciously trying to put in, or make sure I have, some kind of out for 6k Arrival Cybers in my deck. So it's definitely something that you need to be prepared for still in this format, I think. Alright, next here we have Soul Tenyi. So this is a deck that was a very solid contender for Tier 1. Not even just a solid contender, it was a very, entrenched Tier 1 deck. It had been since its release. And now, I think truly, for the first time since its release, way back, and I think it was May, Season 5, we are seeing Soul go down to a Tier 2 deck. Yeah, it's finally been knocked down, I think, from Tier 1 to Tier 2. Now, of course, losing a tier, as always, doesn't mean the deck is now, unplayable. It is, of course, still a fantastic deck that is more than capable of topping tournaments and reaching Diamond 1, not even just with the right pilot, relatively easily. If you spend enough time just learning the deck, you should be able to perform well enough with it. But it is definitely a kind of, noticeable shift in power level that we're seeing here, because we're seeing decks like Soul and Branded Despia get knocked down to Tier 2. Among other decks that were very strong, and I honestly do think got knocked down to Tier 2, is actually going to be Mathmech. Now, I think Mathmech is at the top of Tier 2, and pre-Sprite, I would have basically labeled this as the Tier 1 category, right? And I think in this order as well, where Mathmech is... keep in mind, these differences are slight. It's not like, Mathmech is way better than Soul is way better than Branded Despia. I think, in my opinion, it's more like Mathmech is honestly on par with, if not just a little bit stronger than Soul. And then Soul, again, you could argue on par, but I think a little bit stronger than Branded Despia. I could really see an argument for this, power level, honestly, though. But I don't know. It's really more of a case of, I feel like Soul has more room to tech cards than Branded Despia, and having good tech cards is actually really important for a format like we're in right now, where we're seeing, yes, you could argue that Sprite is one deck that's kind of being dominant, but it's spread out over so many different variants that, we're seeing tech that's useful against all of them. And not just all of them, but also a lot of... We'll actually get into this more. I have a Staples tier list video that's I'm planning on releasing in the next couple of days, so I'll definitely get more into that when the time comes. But for the time being, yeah, these three decks here, like I said, this definitely would have been Tier 1, even as recently as, well, the time of recording this anyway, a week ago. But yeah, now these are definitely decidedly Tier 2 decks, which again doesn't mean they're bad, just that they're not as prevalent as they once were. That said, I will make this disclaimer. Any deck that I put on this tier list here, and I think we've got 20 total here, I think these are decks that are all definitely capable of hitting Diamond easily, well, relatively easily, some easier than others, but even the Rogue decks I think are definitely capable of hitting Diamond, and the Rogue decks, I will say, would definitely need a more dedicated pilot to specifically reach Diamond 1, that or more time, but it's definitely not impossible. So I know it's really easy in this meta to feel like Sprite, it's kind of Sprite or bust, right? If you want to play competitively, be that, reaching Diamond 1 or topping in tournaments, but that's definitely not the case. I mean, we look at the MCS, we saw, I think it was 8 Runic Sprite and then 2 Pure Sprite in the top 16. So Soul and Branded Despia and Mathmech also had decent showings in the top cut. You also got to figure too that, with Sprite being as new as it is, there's going to be a lot of people gravitating towards it. And well, we'll talk about this actually when we get to Runic Sprite. I have some thoughts about Runic Sprite and just how prevalent it is or isn't in this meta. For the time being, let's actually talk about Punk. So Punk is something that, or a deck rather, that I admittedly need to do more research on. I very much am interested in Punk variants, but just between all the Sprite decks and tournament prep and prepping Sprite decks for tournaments, I just haven't gotten a chance to test out Punk variants myself. But there are some notable variants. We did see Tri-Brigade Punk get top 16, I think top 8 actually. It was top 8 definitely in the MCS as well. And that's a list I'm very interested in and very interested to share with you all as well. Well, I might not be the one doing the sharing, but that's also a future video. In any case, all the different Punk variants I've kind of lumped into one here, even though, kind of like Spright, they are spread out amongst a lot of different decks, and there is even the pure Punk variant as well. I'm still just going to, for the sake of convenience, kind of lump them all into one. I will say that the Punk decks as a whole, you could make an argument that they are upper rogue, but I'm actually going to put them in lower tier 3 because Dinomorphia really does add a lot of consistency to the deck. Just in the few times, not even a few times honestly, it's been a decent number of times that I've played against Punk on ladder, and I can definitely see like a noticeable increase like in the consistency of that deck. I will say that Punk does still seem to have a weakness of like Ash on the E-Tally really hurts, so does negating the Endymion, but the Deer Note, definitely a welcome addition for that deck, and definitely helps a lot of those issues from what I can tell as well. Alright, next up we're going to take a look at Floowandereeze. So this is a deck that I've honestly seen like less and less of, even leading up to Spright, like before it came out, which kind of baffles me a little bit. Floowandereeze is not, I don't think, gotten particularly any worse, even post Spright. I think it's probably, I'm probably gonna put it in like upper tier 3. I really want to put it in lower tier 2, but I think upper tier 3 just feels more right. I will say that this format, more than ever, because the card is being searched up more than ever, Maxi is more prevalent than ever in the meta, and having a deck that's fully immune to it is very nice. And also, of course, Spright is a very Link-centric deck, and M-Pen is very good against Link monsters, and just Floowandereeze tends to be just very good against the meta in general. I do still think that, these decks up here in tier 2 are a higher power level than Floowandereeze, which is the reason that I'm not putting Floowandereeze in lower tier 2, but yeah, I think upper tier 3 is a good place for the deck. Again, just haven't been seeing a lot of it, neither on ladder nor represented in the tournaments either. So I wish I could say a bit more about this deck's place in the meta, but I just haven't really come up against it much. Alright, Endymion. Endymion's been a pretty consistent mainstay, bouncing between tier 3 and rogue, kind of like honestly the other rogue decks we have here right now, Adamancipator and Marincess. So I think Endymion is definitely still decidedly rogue. I think I'd put it above Marincess though, like slightly. I mean, they're pretty much on par in terms of their power level. Endymion is one of those decks that I will say is probably underrepresented, almost assuredly underrepresented for its power level, just due to the complexity of the deck. There are a couple decks, Dragon Link is another notable one, where just again, due to how intensive the combos are and how like high the learning curve is for the deck, you just don't see that many people playing it. And it also requires like a good number of ultra rares that don't see a lot of play and in a whole lot of other decks either. So it's a bit restrictive in terms of not only crafting requirements, but also, again, the learning curve. But I think those who are and have learned Endymion can testify that it is a very good deck. And I think it is still a good deck, even in Spright format. Alright, so speaking of the elephant in the room, the level/rank/link to elephant in the room, Sprites. So here, represented by Gigantic Sprite, I'm going to be talking about pure Sprites specifically. So, well, let's get this out of the way. They're definitely a tier 1 deck. Pure Sprite, I think, is absolutely tier 1 right now. And honestly, it's interesting. I see a lot more Runic Sprites being represented both on Diamond, Ladder, and in tournaments as well. And the natural inclination would be to see that and think, oh, Runic Sprite must be significantly better than Pure Sprite because it's seeing so much more play across, just highly competitive situations. It's going to be that the top of Diamond, Ladder, or tournaments. But I personally don't think this is the case. I will say this. I do think Runic Sprite is a stronger deck than Pure Sprite, but I think it's slightly. I think it's a lot closer than a lot of people think. I think it's really, really close, actually, between the two. The reason that Pure Sprite doesn't see as much representation as Runic Sprite is because Pure Sprite is very much an unsolved deck, whereas Runic Sprite, by opposition, is a very solved deck. So, for those who aren't familiar with that terminology, solved versus unsolved, this refers to how, flexible, not even necessarily flexible, but it all comes down to getting the right 40 cards, right? Soul Tenyi is another example of a solved deck. You do see a bit of variety in some of the tech choices that people use, but generally speaking, most Soul Tenyi decks are going to use the same about 34 to 36 cards. The same is going to be true of Runic Sprite as well. Although with Runic Sprite, it's honestly closer to 37. Well, maybe more 35 to 37 cards. But there's not a whole lot of room to improve necessarily. So, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, Runic Sprite is, and we'll talk about this when we get to that deck. But I would say is the best deck of this format right now. But again, I think the difference between it and Pure is a lot closer. Just because you have Pure Sprite, there's so many different ways to build it, right? As far as the level 2 engines go, you could play Nimble Beaver, you could play Nimble Beaver with or without Nimble Angler, you could play Deep Sea Diva, you could play that with or without Yamataka Orochi. You could play Dark Beckoning Beast with 1 or 2 gates, of the Spirit Gate, opening of the Spirit Gates. I can never remember that card's name. And then even beyond that, even once you have your level 2 engine in and your core Sprite cards and your staples like Maxi and Ash Blossom and all that stuff, you still have 10 open slots after that. So there's so much room to explore with Pure Sprite that I think that's why we're not seeing it represented as much in Diamond, or as much as Runic Sprite, that is, in Upper Diamond and these top cuts of tournaments, because it is very much an unsolved deck. I personally find that to be very fun, and even though I do have fun playing Runic Sprite because I do like control decks, I honestly have been finding Pure Sprite to be the most fun I've been having playing this format. I really like trying to figure out okay, in this meta, what is the right how do we fill these slots in Pure Sprite? And it's not even necessarily a case of there are going to be cards that are definitively, objectively the best to slot in to those open, spaces that Pure Sprite has. It's very much going to depend on what the rest of the meta looks like and, what you expect to play against, so on and so forth. So I think there's just so much room to explore with Pure Sprite. And I can understand why people would be, tired of the deck, or because you're seeing it everywhere. So some people might be hearing me say this and be like, how can you find Sprite, fun? I honestly do think it is the variety. And it's kind of ironic because, yes, there is a lack of variety in that Sprite is everywhere, but within Sprite, there is so much variety. Not just even, again, in terms of the deck you play it in, or the, decks you mix it with, but even Pure Sprite, just so much variety in terms of what you can slot in. That's what I find fun about the deck. Alright, so, yeah, wow. Let's go on to Runic now. So, this is not Runic Sprite. We have that kind of later on over here. This, represented by Jess Hugin, is going to be quote-unquote pure Runic, which is really more like stun Runic, but you could arguably lump the other, like we've been doing in the past. It's kind of encompasses mainly stun Runic, but also synchro Runic, invoked Runic, although really with how good Runic Sprite is, it kind of makes sense, or it kind of doesn't make sense to mix Runic with any other archetype but Sprite. But as far as the stun variant goes, I'm going to put this in tier 3, but I'm actually going to put it in the end of tier 3. I feel like this could even go in Upper Rogue. I'm not even going to lie, but I think it's still solid enough, being the best Floodgate deck right now, that I'll put it at the bottom of tier 3. And the reason I think Runic Sprite, or not, sorry, jeez, I'm so used to saying Sprite after Runic. The reason that I think Runic Stun got worse is because Sprite kind of forces them to very much split off in terms of what floodgates they want to play. Before, they could resolve skill drain and or there can only be one, and those would both be good against pretty much every single deck. There can only be one not, super great against Branded Despia, but otherwise you could, play. You didn't have to diversify the floodgates that you were playing in order to hit all the decks, but with Spright now thrown into the mix, there can only be one. Doesn't really do much against that, so, now it's like, okay, they're kind of thinking, like, do we want to run Rivalry, because there is a decent variety of types, but then you kind of lose to Mathmech and Sword Soul if you do that, so, and also, Spright also running a decent variety of attributes means they can't really pin him down with Gozen. I have run into some of the Runic Floodgate decks playing stuff like Stygian Dirge, which reduces the levels of monsters on the field. On top of that, there is... what was the other one I saw recently that was like very specific? Oh, and the Band played on, where you can't special summon monsters if you have a monster of that level or rank on the field. So there is that, but at the same... And like those are like not completely useless against some of these other decks here in the meta as well, but... Just the fact that, these Floodgate decks are now forced to diversify the number of Floodgates, they don't want that. They want to just be able to play a very specific set of Floodgates and have that be good against the whole field. Because these kind of, like, stun decks very much rely on consistency, and when they have to rely on multiple Floodgates to be able to hit, all the different decks of the meta, that's going to be a pretty big hamper to their overall consistency. So... yeah, the stun Runic decks I just would not expect to see nearly as much of moving forward, and even if you do, you'll find, I think most of the time, that their floodgates are going to be a little less impactful than they have been in the past. That's just my 2 cents, though. So, alright, Labyrinth. Labyrinth, I think, is still a pretty consistent rogue force. Pretty much has been this whole time. I think I'm also going to put it here between Endymion and Marincess, although I think, again... these are all generally about the same. I think Adamancipator is like a decent head above the rest of these, but Labyrinth, if you're looking for a good trap-based control deck that does not use floodgates, that is of course going to be still the deck of choice, but of course in that regard, it is still very much a deck that kind of lives or dies, not all the time, not every single time, but a lot of the time, whether it goes first or not. That is to say, the games aren't unwinnable if you go second, but it's very much an uphill battle. Especially if, you're not able to stop them from comboing off, which a lot of the time Labyrinth decks don't have room for as much in-hand disruption, because they have to make room for more face-down disruption that they'll set, so it can be a little bit of a rough time sometimes, but that does not mean that Labyrinth is a bad deck by any means, and of course I always say this when we talk about Labyrinth's current position in the meta. There is future support for the deck that will definitely and significantly boost its power level, so it's definitely worth hanging on to those Labyrinth cards, even if you're not playing it for the time being. Alright, next up here we have Exo Sisters. I chose Martha from the new set to represent them. Exo Sisters were a deck that were around before, but got a good deal of like very good new support in this latest pack. Not just Martha, but also the new... I think the rank 4 that takes 2 rank 4s to summon it is new, if I recall correctly. So, Exo Sisters definitely got a very nice power boost, and they are definitely looking very good in the future as well, as we see, a certain graveyard-based deck. It's tier limits for those who don't know. As we see that coming out at some point in the future, Exo Sister is going to be very nice against them as well. And even now, like, you look at Spright. Spright has a lot of graveyard interaction between Spright Elf, Swap Frog, Ronin Totem, just a lot of different stuff that they're doing there. And, Runic Sprite is moving cards out of the graveyard, so... between, like, the relevance of, decks doing that in this meta and, again, the power boost we got from the new support, Exo Sister has managed to break out of, like, lower rogue or even casual, I think, to a solid tier 3 deck. I'm actually going to put it... I'll put it right here next to the Punk support. I think they're pretty much about in the same spot in the meta. Now, to be fair, we are seeing a significant number of people playing these probably because they're new. I think as time goes on, we'll see a little bit less of these decks in the meta, but I don't think that necessarily changes their power level. Exo Sister, again, we could see an increased power level when the meta, or rather when a certain graveyard-based deck that I already mentioned becomes very relevant upon its release. Alright, next we have Sky Striker. Sky Striker did get to enjoy a decent amount of time as a lower tier 2, upper tier 3 deck. Nowadays, though, I don't know. It's just like it feels really hard as a. It honestly feels really hard as a control deck that's not either a Floodgate deck or Runic Sprite to kind of be in this meta because you have a hard time keeping up with the Sprite decks as it is, and then when you do get paired up against Runic Sprite, like you're just like done. In the control mirror, you know, the control deck that can more consistently generate more resources is going to do better, and I think against like literally any other control deck, that's just gonna be Runic Sprite in this meta. Like Runic Sprite is just gonna like I won't necessarily like so easily, but it's going to relatively easily just kind of like tear through those other control decks in terms of like their card advantage and stuff. So yeah, Sky Striker definitely I think is one of those decks that's feeling the impact a little bit more than some other decks. I'm actually gonna put Sky Striker at the top of Rogue. I really think that's where they're at right now, which is unfortunate. I really like Sky Striker. I think it's a very fun deck, especially with linkage. But I honestly can't really see myself putting it in tier 3 right now. I think I'm just going to leave it, unfortunately, down here in Rogue. Dinomorphia, which actually, to my surprise, managed to stay fairly relevant, even a good bit after the release of its new support. This is another deck that I think I'm going to decidedly put in Rogue. It's right, you know, it's among all these other decks, right? Like Endymion, excuse me, Labyrinth and Marincess. In that, you know, it's a very solid deck. It can do well, but it's just gonna be more difficult, and or it's gonna take someone who knows the deck very well to be able to consistently do very well with a deck like Dinomorphia. But at the same time, far from impossible, not even improbable. I still think it's an extremely solid deck. So, Runic Sprite, I've talked about a lot leading up to this, because like you can't talk about this meta without talking about Runic Sprite. I mean, it's just going to be the top here, right? It's just going to be like the tier 1 deck to beat at the moment. But again, I will say that even though, like if you look at tournament tops, you see a significantly higher number of Runic Sprites than like pure Sprite, I think the power difference between these two is smaller than that would like lead you to believe. Again, I think it's due to Runic Sprite being a very solved deck, whereas pure Sprite is very much an unsolved deck. But both are definitely tier 2, and you know, even solvedness aside, I think Runic Sprite's power level is still going to be higher than pure Sprite. Alright, next up we have Dragon Link. This is another deck that has taken a fairly unfortunate fall from grace. I touched on it before. It's like Endymion, where the level of play that it sees is kind of hampered a bit by how complex of a deck that it is. The hit of Grass to 2 also hurt, but definitely did not make the deck unplayable by any means. I really want to put Dragon Link in tier 3, but I have to put it at the top of Rogue in this current meta. Now, I will say, Bestials upon release will definitely make Dragon Link a much more relevant deck, so if you've been playing Dragon Link but you're not as much anymore, I would definitely not dust away those cards. I would not get rid of them. I would definitely hold on to them because, again, Bestial's very powerful light and dark dragon-based deck. Yeah, that's definitely going to make Dragon Link a significantly bit stronger once those cards come out. Alright, speaking of, well, not speaking of decks that got significantly stronger or will get stronger, but rather decks that unfortunately have just gotten weaker over time. That's going to be Salamangreats. Like, even with the release of MathMech, I'm just really unfortunately not feeling Salamangreats like at all in this current meta, which is sad because Salamangreats are a very fun deck and I think they're very cool as well. But like, honestly, they were kind of struggling to keep up a little bit in my opinion. And then MathMech Circular came out and MathMech Salamangreats was like, yeah, it was definitely a thing, but at the same time, you know, we definitely saw decks like Ignister make much better use of MathMechs. Code Talkers also made a much better use of MathMechs. And even all this time, I think Marincess, like, even though they didn't, you know, didn't incorporate MathMechs at all, like, even after Salamangreats got MathMechs, in terms of Cyber decks, like, I think Marincess were still better, honestly. Again, nothing against Salads. I love the deck. It's a lot of fun. I gotta put it at like the bottom of this tier list though. I honestly kind of struggled if I even wanted to include it in the tier list, but the main reason I even did include it was just to unfortunately lament at how far this deck has fallen in terms of power level there. Alright, so here it's kind of difficult to tell, unfortunately, because of the way the image got cut, but this is Tri-Brigade Sprite with Gigantic Sprite. So this is Tri-Sprite. Tri-Brigade Sprite, where do I want to put this deck? Even now, I really struggle to say where exactly I think this deck should go, but I'm inclined to say tier 3. As far as where in tier 3, I'd put it right about here, I think. Honestly, I would say that these 3 decks here are about the same power level. You could put these 3 in just about any order. Exo Sister, Punk Variants, and Tri-Sprite. Tri-Sprite is a deck that is very much missing some things in order to kind of break into these higher tier levels. It's missing another solid link too, whether that be Pit Knight Airly and or Spright Sprint. When either of those cards come out, whichever comes out first, they will definitely boost the power level of Sprites. But Spright Sprint will actually be a notable combo piece in the deck, whereas Pit Knight Airly is more of an endboard piece. The Spright Sprint will make it a lot easier to dump like Tri-Brigade Kit from the deck. You don't necessarily need to open Fractal to like start accessing your Tri-Brigade engine. So that would be definitely a huge consistency boost for the deck. And then Pit Knight Airly is Quick Effect Monster Negation in a Link 2, which is definitely something that the end board of Tri-Sprite is desperately needing. Cypher Lambda, I've said it so many times, the card just feels so bad to summon. I don't like summoning it, so. Alright, another Spright variant that I'm honestly, even right now, very much struggling where to place on this tier list. This was actually the hardest deck for me to kind of place on here right now is Live Twin Sprite, because I think right now it's being underrepresented, at least on like the North American or like the TCG side of things. From what I've read, the OCG Master Duel player base is a lot more up on this deck, and I think it sees a lot more play over there. I honestly have not seen this deck at all. Like, I've run into it in ladder like maybe 3 times in like the almost week now that Sprites have come out. Maybe not quite that few, but it's definitely, it's significantly less than Runic and Pure. I think I'm pretty sure I've run into more Tri-Sprites even than Live Twin Sprites. It's hard for me to say for sure. Like, I want to say definitely, but of course that could be a selection bias in my brain. But for now, I'm going to put Twin Sprites at the bottom of Tier 2. I think this feels about right. I could see them being in Tier 3 as well, but they are definitely stronger than Tri-Sprite. Like, that's definitely, like, they're definitely noticeably higher power level. That said, I think in my opinion, they're also a bit lower power level than Runic Sprite and Pure Sprite. The main thing, honestly, that I'm not sure of myself is how well Twin Sprite fares against like the rest of the Tier 2 pool. Like, if I had a more definitive answer on that, then, you know, then I'd be more inclined to maybe put it like the top if that were the case, or like, you know, if I felt so up on the deck, maybe even like the bottom of Tier 1. But as it currently stands, this is the Spright variant that I have not only seen the least, but also have the least amount of current experience with. I might have to actually do some playtesting in order to amend that and figure out exactly what I think of this deck right now. I will say that like a lot of people who are on the deck like really swear by it, so that kind of leads me to believe that it is a deck that is probably being slept on a little bit in terms of like its exact place in the meta. But it's definitely, like, if it is Tier 3, it's got to be the top of Tier 3. That's why I'm inclined to say Tier 2. But with time, we'll see the meta kind of shake out, and with experience, we'll be able to get a more definitive grasp of where we want this deck. Alright, so that is going to cover the tier list. I made a very nice, like, even step pattern here. I didn't even plan that, but yeah, I think this is about where everything is right now as far as like the current meta goes. Definitely let me know in the comments below what you think of the tier list. If you think, you know, any certain deck should be in a different spot, definitely don't be afraid to let me know. Not that you all are, but yeah, I want to hear from you all in the comments whether you agree or disagree, especially if you disagree, honestly. Yeah, let me know what your personal tier list is. But in any case, let's go ahead and move now to our outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now, so without further ado, this is Xlex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.